Hebrews says that he offered up with loud cries, prayers, and supplications to the one who was able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverence. Jesus was heard. Never confuse not getting what you asked for with not being heard. Never confuse not getting what you asked for with not being answered. Right? We have this tendency that we call answered prayer when we get what we want. Answered prayer is when God has his way. And he always has his way, which means every prayer gets answered. But I think there's something much deeper here. Jesus wasn't kept from dying, but he was saved from death. He wasn't kept from the cross, but he was saved from the grave. Right? So to the one he was answered by who? The one who could save him from death. And he was answered because of his reverence. He was saved from death. 3 days into death, God raised him up from it. It had to be entered to be defeated. It had to be faced to be finished. Had Jesus never died, had God saved him from dying, death would still sting. The grave would still be victorious. But because Jesus died and was raised, those who believe in him, though we die, we live forever. He wasn't kept from dying, but he was saved from death. Verse 8 says, although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. Let me ask an uncomfortable question. What if obedience is in itself a form of suffering? Because I think a lot of us think that if we obey, we shouldn't suffer. Right? I think a lot of us, when suffering starts, we go, but God, I did what you said. But what if obedience is in itself a form of suffering? We often preach the rewards of obedience, that if you do what God asks, then you'll get what you want. But Jesus teaches us the suffering of obedience. And in fact, if we really take the time, I think all Scripture teaches the suffering of obedience. Not for the reward, but because God is worthy to be obeyed and he is worthy to be suffered for. Here's what I mean. Obedience requires that I lay down my will, my desires, my understanding, and that I trust God. That's suffering. Not getting my way is suffering. Not having what I dreamed of is suffering. Not going where I wanted to go is suffering. But Jesus is worthy of that suffering. And he's worthy of that level of trust. He's worthy of all of our obedience. And the question is, why? What is it that makes him worthy? It's because he's a better reward. He is a better portion. He is a better love, a better friend, a better promise. He's better than anything and everything that we might have to set aside so that we can be obedient.